Welcome back to the exam preparation video series for DP-300, Administrating Microsoft Azure SQL Solutions. I'm Sara, a Microsoft Technical Trainer. This is the second episode out of the total 5 episodes in this series. In this episode, we'll focus on implementing a secure environment. So we will cover how to configure database authentication and authorization, implement security for data at rest and data in transit, and implement compliance controls for sensitive data. Here's a list of all the different skills you may be tested on. These are sometimes referred to as the may include, meaning they may or may not be on your exam. This list isn't exhaustive, and while we won't be covering every single skill in this video, be sure you can perform these skills before taking the exam. As part of securing Azure SQL environments, configuring Microsoft intra-authentication is essential. Expect exam questions on how to enable and manage intra-IT authentication for Azure SQL database and managed instance. Be aware that intra-authentication eliminates the need for SQL authentication passwords, which enhances security, and make sure you know how to assign roles, configure settings, and also enable communication. Know how to configure Microsoft intra-authentication for SQL Server, a secure alternative to traditional SQL authentication. We'll also know why it matters. This eliminates password-based logins for better security, and it requires app registration, permissions, and also certificate setup. Another key security concept are service principals. So make sure you know service principals authenticate using client certificates or client secrets. Don't confuse this with managed identities. The key here, security first. Always limit privileges to reduce risks. So this is a common exam scenario, also moving from a user account to a service principal. In the next topic here, we're examining configuring database and object-level permissions using graphic tools. So in Azure SQL, you can create an Azure Active Directory server principal using the create login from external provider. And the first Azure ID login must be created by the system administrator SQL account or the Azure administrator. So keep those in mind. SQL Server and Azure SQL Database also use granular permissions for tables, views, functions, and stored procedures. So know the 4 DML permissions: select, insert, update, and delete. Also know the ones beyond DML permissions like control, references, and view definition, which will manage the broader access. And know about the execute versus control, which runs a function or procedure that controls and grants full ownership. So also practice those assigning and revoking those permissions in SSMS, or actually you can use it also in Azure Data Studio. Next, the principle of least privilege. This is critical security concept, granting only minimal access needed for users, apps, and services. Remember, unused and excessive permissions can accumulate over time, making potential attacks possible. So understand that Azure Intra-ID consent framework and compare that to the human consent, where users are manually approved data access, and this framework enforces admin-defined policies to ensure the least privilege compliance. So for the exam, define those precise permissions before deployment, avoid things like wildcards, and audit regularly with access reviews or Azure PIM to maintain the least privilege. Also, troubleshooting and authentication and authorization issues is a key exam topic. Transient faults, if you see kind of things like login failures, we always check the Azure Service Dashboard or for outages. If you can't log in, check if the login is disabled or missing. What about kind of fixing connection strings? Verify those in Azure Portal's connection string bleed. This is normally a quick fix for many login issues. So make sure you know the difference between server-level credentials and database scoped credentials as well, because this is also a common exam question. And be aware that these credentials are tied to SQL Server instance and can be used across multiple databases. Transparent data encryption is a key security feature for Azure SQL. So know how it works. Know about TDE and how it encrypts data at the page level and decrypts it automatically when read into memory. Know also about how it secures data at rest using a database encryption key that's protected by a certificate. Know about the different keys and options that you can actually use an Azure provided key or bring your own key with Azure Key Vault. And don't confuse TDE with always encrypted. TDE protects data at rest. Always encrypted secures data in use. So expect questions on this difference. Next, we talk about object-level encryption, which now protects individual columns of sensitive data using symmetric encryption or unlike actually transparent data encryption, which secures the entire database at rest. So know the steps for encrypting a column with symmetric encryption and expect DP-300 exam questions on when to use object-level encryption versus TDE and how to implement column encryptions effectively. Another part of security here is firewall rules. These are critical for securing Azure SQL databases. So know the difference. Know about server-level firewall rules, which apply to all the database on a server. Know about the different database-level firewall rules, which apply only to a specific database. And know about the different commands that we used here. A common mistake, server firewall rules do not grant database access unless the user has the right permission. So if neither rule allows the client IP, the connection will fail. So always remember that. Next, always encrypted, as we were saying, this is another key security feature. And this is a client-side encryption technology. So know about how it ensures sensitive data is never visible in plain text inside SQL Server. So even if you're a database administrator or a cloud admin, the encryption and decryption happen on the client side. So with keys stored in a trusted key store, this is also really important. Know that there are three main deployment scenarios: the client and data on-prem, client on-prem with data in Azure, or client and data in Azure. Next, let's talk about VBS enclaves. This is also another advanced security feature that we can use in Azure SQL. Always encrypted protects sensitive data by ensuring it's never exposed as plain text, as we said. VBS enclaves actually take this further. They allow those computations on encrypted data without decrypting it. So using something called a virtual secure mode to create kind of a secure memory region with no special hardware needed. So understand when to use VBS enclaves versus the traditional always encrypted. And expect questions testing the different and those use cases. Another key concept is securing database access, which starts with authentication and secure connection strings. So know about SQL authentication and how we require logins stored in SQL Server and how users must enter those credentials each time, which can sometimes increase the security risks. So this is where we can use Azure Active Directory authentication, which is a more secure option, allowing those users mapped to an identity and no need for logins in the master database. Know also the connection string best practices. For example, always encrypted connections to prevent data interception and how we can use server certificates instead of blindly trusting them as well. Here we're talking about data classification. This is a key security feature, again, that helps protect sensitive information at the column level. And there are 4 classification levels, so know about public, general, confidential, and highly confidential. These help categorize data based on sensitivity. You can also use those in SSMS or T-SQL. And you also need to know the 3 key steps for classification: discovery and recommendation, labeling, and also visibility. Then comes auditing in Azure SQL, which helps ensure compliance. It helps us track database activity and identify any unusual trends. So there are some key concepts that you need to know. Azure SQL, for example, logs database events and stores them in blob storage. We also can use Log Analytics or Event Hub for review. So server-level audits apply to all databases on the server, while database-level audits track activity at the individual database level. This helps us kind of detect anomalies, we can generate reports, and just maintain an audit trail for security investigation. So know how to enable auditing in Azure in the portal and where to store those logs. Next, tracking data changes is also another crucial concept in SQL Server, and you need to differentiate between change data capture, change data tracking, and temporal tables on the exam. Don't mistake the difference between CDC and temporal tables. This is focused on DML tracking, while temporal tables provide a complete history. Lastly, we have dynamic data masking, which helps protect sensitive information by masking those data for non-privileged users. So make sure you're familiar with the 5 masking rules and be aware that DDM does not encrypt data. It just only applies a masking layer, which can be bypassed with sufficient permissions. So this is actually useful for scenarios where users need to interact with the data without viewing any sensitive data, such as customer support teams, or maybe I'm reviewing a credit card record, so I don't need to actually see the full numbers. To recap, in this episode, we discussed how to configure database authentication and authorization, implement security for data at rest and data in transit, and implement compliance controls for sensitive data. Remember, this group accounts for 15 to 20% of the exam, so keep that in mind when preparing for the exam. Thank you for watching episode 2 on implementing a secure environment. Be sure to join us for episode 3, where we're going to be covering monitoring, configuring, and optimizing database resources.